Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are the Varsity Voices, where we bring you information, insights on topics related to high school sports, as well as covering the Chicago Catholic League. Be sure to subscribe, follow, and like us wherever you listen from. And I'm Joe Frevoletti, one of your hosts. Here with me is your other host, Dan Frevoletti. And today on the podcast, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Scott Grant. He's a leader in education, leadership, and personal branding. Dr. Grant is a former high school teacher, athletic director, varsity head coach, and school board member turned award-winning professor at the University of Findlay, specializing in educational leadership, marketing, and social media. He's also the founder of Triple Threat Leadership, where he empowers schools, organizations, and students with NIL education, personal branding strategies, and leadership development. And through his Branding of Me course, he's helped nearly 10,000 high school student athletes build proactive and positive personal brands. Dr. Grant, I'd like to welcome you to the Varsity Voices podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's absolutely my pleasure.
Great. Well, one of the things, as I just read through the intro, and you talk about, or one of the things that you deal with is personal branding, which I find very interesting, especially at the high school level. But why is it important for high school athletes to develop their own personal brand, in your opinion?
Interesting. So it's always funny when people ask me about personal branding because I started Triple Threat Leadership in 2016-17, right? Before NIL was a thing. And it was really because my students at the time were struggling with social media. Everybody would say, don't do this, but they wouldn't tell them what to do. So I teach branding in a very different way. I don't teach branding related to, hey, you got to do this in a branding perspective to create NIL. It's more about, this is a life skill everybody needs to understand and do. It's, what are your values and how do you live those every single day in person and online? And for student athletes right now, social media especially has become such an integral part of their lives that branding component dives into every piece. Recruiting. I mean, you can't find a college coach right now that doesn't follow kids on social media. I worked at the Division II and Division I levels. I mean, that was part of our job. I mean, that's what we did. We followed them on social media. We wanted to see their reactions. We wanted to see, if I met you in person and I met you online, would I be meeting the same person? And what value are you going to add to our organization? And the biggest thing to answer your question is, student athletes have this tool at their disposal, something that they utilize probably more than anything else they do during the day. And very few of them have ever sat down and said, all right, what is my personal brand? What do I want it to be? And how am I going to actually create strategies and actions to bring that to life? It's not hard when you ask them the right questions. And it's such a valuable component for everybody. I've continued to push that forward for all students and student athletes.
Yeah. And the benefit or the value from personal branding for student athletes at the high school level. Obviously, there's a lot of things out there that are somewhat tied back to their personal brand, especially in today's environment, right? And like you mentioned, recruiting, and recruiting leads to scholarships. One of the things we'll get into here a little bit is NIL, and your personal branding as far as that's concerned, and what your value is as an individual from a name and image and likeness standpoint. So is that really where the value kind of is for especially high school athletes?
No, I mean, I think the value is more of helping kids understand what's important to them and how they're bringing that to life, right? Like, I honestly, everyone now who teaches about NIL teaches like, oh, you got to build an NIL-centric personal brand. Like, to me, that's honestly the incorrect way to teach it. The way in which you teach personal branding has nothing to do with NIL or athletics. It's more about, if athletics is an important part of you, then how are you ensuring that's coming out in your actions every single day? And like, what does the interaction with you as a student athlete look like, right? Like, if you're only posting your highlight clips all the time, like, I'm going to be like, this guy's full of himself, right? Like what's the story being read about you as an individual? And how are you bringing to life? It's like, what's my living resume? What's connecting to other people? Not just, hey, build this personal brand so you can have NIL opportunities. Now, do they potentially go hand in hand moving forward? Yeah, absolutely. If I'm a company considering a kid for a partnership, I don't want to go to their social media and think like, "Ooh, what's that kid doing?" Right? Like, that's not value to my organization. So it starts without any of that additional conversation in my mind. But that, of course, just like anything, jobs, careers, it's part of the conversation as it moves forward and you understand what you're doing.
Dr. Grant, you guys have both mentioned NIL, and obviously we've seen a lot of that start to filter down from college. It gets a lot of attention in college, and even with the national championship game this past week, I heard dollar figures associated with it. How much of what you do, on the high school level has to do with level setting and expectations setting for high school kids as far as what they can expect, when it comes to NIL?
Yeah, so it's interesting because part of my uniqueness, I guess, is I only focus on high school NIL, right? I only focus on high school NIL. And as I tell everybody, college NIL and high school NIL are not the same thing in any way, shape, or form. And anybody who says anything differently, you don't understand it, right? Because college NIL is governed by technically a national association. In high school, it's ultimately name, image, and likeness activities are separate from a student athlete's athletic ability. Now, and performance. Now, we know they're tied, but technically the states govern that in a way that's very, very different. The majority of kids are not in the 2% elite, right? The Bryce Underwoods who's getting a $10 million football recruitment offer. Like, that's not normal. I just gave a presentation 20 minutes ago to a bunch of student athletes and parents. The median social NIL activity is about $60 to $80, right? And for most high school kids, it's like something that's free, right? Like, hey, promote my product and we'll give you a free t-shirt or a free thing of protein. It's not, we're going to pay you $100,000, right? And even if you are that kind of kid, you better have your back end processes and everything else ready to go because you're in a different category, right? So helping people realize the regulations are different, the way in which this works are different, and the whole process is different. So that's really where I try to help people understand. I'm a policy guy. I help them understand the high school policies, what it means, what are the questions you have to ask. And I work predominantly on the school and stakeholder side. I don't help student athletes monetize. That's not what I do, right? Because I'm an educator. I educate on what this all means and how to maintain safety and compliance moving forward in whatever path you choose to go.
So you mentioned, and we've heard this before, the average NIL deal for a high school athlete is $65 to $80. And, I get that. I understand that. The other thing which I think plays into this is we've seen how this has evolved at the college level as far as the deals, the dollar amounts, those kinds of things. Do you see that same kind of evolution happening at the high school level at some point over the next several years?
You know what? To be honest, I think the further that the college level gets to where it's going, let's face it, it's a train wreck, right? Anybody who doesn't say it's a train wreck, it's a train wreck. The further of a train wreck it continues to be, I think the further away it gets from high school NIL in any way, shape, or form. And honestly, the better for high school NIL, because I think a large majority of people don't like what's happening at the college space, and they're scared to death that it's going to happen at the high school space. The other thing people don't realize, which, the state associations govern their states individually, right? So we have 43 states that allow high school NIL in some way, shape, or form, and their policies are all different. So what's allowed in Illinois is different than what's allowed in Kentucky, than what's allowed in Georgia. It's not easy. It's not simple to understand. I think state association executive directors are trying to become more and more educated. Like I told you, I just spent time at their winter meetings discussing things that are occurring, and they're adding language to their policies to ensure collectives aren't coming into play. to ensure that people who are trying to make high school NIL similar to college NIL aren't able to do so. Mainly because there's a bigger safety and compliance issue when you're dealing with minors, when you're dealing with high school kids and educational based athletics. So I think there's a little bit of a give and take there. I don't think you're going to see now. There's going to be the 2%, the Cooper Flags, the Bryce Underwoods, those types of kids, but they're getting a lot of their money from elite level recruitment, roster management, collective elements, organizations that see a massive value because they have a large social media following, right?
Yeah.
I think a lot of the other things, I don't think you're going to see it. And I think if you do, like in Ohio, we just had a sophomore golfer earlier this year. She's played an LPGA event. She's elite. She signed with a representation company, technically an agent, which violates the Ohio High School Athletic Association regulations, and she's lost her high school eligibility. But for her, it doesn't matter anymore because she's going to play at the top level, whether she plays high school golf or whether she doesn't, right? So I think in some sports, you may see kids just say, well, I have these opportunities. The regulations don't allow me to do what I want to do. I don't necessarily need high school athletics anymore the way in which I did. Now, if that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. But I don't think you're going to see what is happening as widespread at the elite college level at the high school level.
You've mentioned a couple players' names and athletes' names, but I guess my question is there any part of the country that's further along with NIL than other parts? Is it, or do you see it kind of as a smattering, or is it player driven? Hey, this athlete's in the 2%. We've got to focus on that. Or is there somewhere where you feel like it's starting to gain momentum, where maybe it's even creeping down to a lot of those $65 to $80 deals in this part of the country for whatever reason?
I think when high school NIL is first approved in the state, there's a little bit of a blip, right? Because in marketing, they call it the first mover advantage. Everybody wants to dabble their toes, right? Everybody wants to be the first male student athlete to sign, the first female student athlete to sign, the first softball player to sign, right? The first bank to sign a high school kid. Like they want to be the first. And then after that, they're like, all right, what's the return on investment that I'm getting? We can't use the school facilities. We can't use the kid in any school gear. It's like, if that student athlete hasn't articulated a large amount of value outside of their high school athletic sport, I think companies are questioning, I don't really get it, right? Like I don't really get it, because it's different at the high school level, right? The college level, you can use some of the marks, you can do different pieces. So I think you're seeing, in some places, there are some states that just have more elite football and men's basketball players, right? Like Georgia, I work with the Georgia High School Athletic Association. I have in the past. I mean, they're a massive hotbed for baseball and football recruits, right? But if you look at the amount of student athletes they have that sign an NIL deal versus the ones that don't, it's still pretty low percentage. Now, with that being said, there's a pocket, like let's say in Cobb County schools may have 18% of the student athletes within that 2% that do it, right? So for him, it's a bigger deal because he's got a lot of kids that are engaging in NIL activities, right? So it's pretty widespread across the country, but you'll see different things, right? Like the first one in Louisiana was a wrestler who signed with a power sports company. There was a freshman in Tennessee who signed with her uncle's insurance agents, and she was a gymnast, and the slogan was "Get a flippin' quote from Freeman Insurance Group," right? So like, it's really, I think now it's more about eyes on market, right? The girl in California was the first girl to throw 2 touchdowns in a football game, right? Like Bella Rasmussen, everybody's talking about it, right? Eyes on market, something unique, something happened. Not, hey, the kid that's the star quarterback at such and such high school, on week 3, he breaks his leg, and what additional value does he provide to an organization? I don't know, right? That's the clarity piece that I think a lot of people question, and a lot of organizations are like, I don't know if this is worth it.
Right. And we've heard that a lot of the energy, especially at the high school level regarding NIL is really kind of outside of the schools themselves, which makes sense, right? Yeah. But I know what you do is you do talk to, state associations, you talk to, different schools or administrators of schools, you talk to parents and athletes as well. Yeah. Does that mean that there's going to be a little bit more of, say, school or association involvement in this, or is it just more of an education aspect for them?
Yeah, I think it's more of an education aspect. I don't think there's too many schools that want to touch it with a 10-foot pole, right? I think the majority of schools are scared to death, just like they are with most regulations. They don't want to get in trouble. And I've spoken at, I would say, 30 state AD association conferences across the country. And the biggest concern is they don't know enough themselves, that they don't want to give bad information to a student athlete or a parent, and something would happen. And they've got to ultimately nail their own kid to the wall with a violation that they might not have known that they were actually doing. Right. And that's where you're seeing some of those pieces. I think state associations are doing the best that they can from the standpoint of they're worried about litigation. They're worried about getting sued because technically, I mean, who are they to define what work is? Right.
Right.
But they can also declare, well, that's not part of interscholastic athletics. Right. Which, that's the biggest thing about high school NIL, right? It's separate from the institution, the interscholastic athletics, right? And they can write policy to ensure that occurs to the best of their ability. The NCAA can't anymore. They can't. I mean, what is it? 75, 80% of all NIL activity at the college level is driven by collectives. It's external entities that are just, paying kids incredible amounts of money at the elite level for, hey, sign a football, right? Or, it doesn't really matter if you do anything. I know there has to be an exchange of services, but ultimately, who are they going to come after?
Right, exactly. And, I always talk about NIL. I'm like, it sounds like it's like the 21st century version of, hey, this, come and wash cars at our car dealership for a couple hours, but instead of that, it's get on social media and, show us going to the dealership, or you're pulling away in a car that you just got, or whatever it might be. But it's a lot of it centers around social media. And I can remember years ago telling my kids about, hey, there's a lot that you have to think about when it comes to safety and security about social media and who's following you and what that means. And is that part of, your presentation to schools and ADs about, hey, they're getting pushed to add followers. We don't know who those followers are. What's the safety aspect of this for kids?
So, when I work with schools, and schools will a lot of times have me come in and do a breakdown for all of their coaches, and they'll have me do a breakdown for all of their student athletes and parents. And they're two separate conversations, but really I do a couple things. One, I go through the policy line by line for their state, and I help them understand, here's what the questions are around this, and this is what this potentially may mean. Now, getting them to understand, at the end of the day, those policies are the Illinois High School Athletic Association, Wisconsin's associations, they're not mine. I'm just telling you, here's the question I would have that you need to ask your AD, that the AD needs to ask the association. But then I walk through example NIL agreements for high school and college kids. We talk about trends. We talk about good ones, bad ones, things that can negatively impact your life moving forward. And this goes out. There was a Oklahoma quarterback whose name was General Booty, and he sells flags that say "I love booty." And there's another kid from OU, and you can Google it. His last name is really bad, and he wore number 69. And I'm telling you what, he built a website, he sold merchandise. In my head, I'm thinking, I don't know what you want to do for a career, but I pray it's not be a high school football coach and teacher, because no way are you getting a job, right? So getting kids to understand that, what's the goal of the NIL? Is it to make a buck? Is it to learn entrepreneurship? Is it to, build a personal brand? Is it to do this? And then I help the schools say, okay, here's what kids need to know to be successful in NIL, but also life, personal branding, communication, financial literacy, legal contracts. You're already teaching them this in certain classes. Now you have this national phenomena that I can help you integrate as projects within that class. And the kids are going to freaking love it. I mean, they're going to love it, right? Because they're going to say like, hey, I never knew what a perpetuity clause was, but if I talk to you about what that means in reference to, hey, man, you just gave away your ability to own any of that thing you just did with that car dealership, we probably should have considered that, right? Or, yeah, here's what you get paid, but you got to pay taxes on that, and your marketing agent's going to take this %. And they're like, well, that doesn't help, right? But because there
it's
are
a lot
those
of work
financial
for $30. Yeah.
Yes, and those and to be honest, man, like kids are minors entering into legal contracts. The parents are involved, right? Are they claiming that money as dependents? It can potentially impact FAFSA and federal Pell Grants. Like, it's a deeper conversation than, oh, I got an NIL deal. Like, if that's all you want to say, just go ahead and say it. You know what I mean? Like, just get it over with.
Yeah, well, we've looked at some of the policies, regulations, bylaws, whatever it might be from some of the different state associations regarding NIL. They all seem to be different.
They are.
Right? Is, from my perspective, that's going to be a problem, right? Going forward. And I know the colleges are struggling with that right now, and they're trying to get their arms wrapped around it. But I would hope that at the high school level that maybe they would get that kind of structure from, at least from a regulatory standpoint or policy standpoint, in place.
Well,
right?
And here's the tough part, right? So high school athletics is one of the last kind of frontiers where there is no national governing body, right? You have the NFHS, but what the NFHS does is regulations and rules for sports, right? They don't govern state associations saying, here are your policies, right? Now, they can support them in understanding that, but it's very specific to each state. And that gets really connected, right? In Ohio, we got 865 high schools, and to pass a referendum about NIL wording is different than in Massachusetts, where they can vote on it by the board of directors, right? Like, even the process and how things get changed in their bylaws is different. And then you start looking at things like Pennsylvania alumni can't enter into NIL agreements with student athletes at their former school, but in other cases there aren't, right? Like, they have a disclosure agreement, but they're all different. It gets tough because what everybody sees is what's happening at the college level, and they don't assume, or they don't think like, oh, the high school probably has different, but then they just assume whatever regulations they see are across the board. Not the case in any way, shape, or form. Now, there are two states that are almost identical, Georgia and Arizona, partially because I worked with both of them, but they're really clean, they're really simple, and they're able to be understood very, very well, right? This doesn't have to be really hard, I don't think, in my professional opinion. But I am hopeful that there's more conversation by the state executive directors who, I just spent time with. They want to do what's best for their student athletes. They're scared about what you talked about earlier, right? Like, how do we tell a kid that they can wash cars for $15 an hour, but they can't stand out front with a sign for $1,000?
Yeah, that's a challenge. And, you had mentioned the aspect of this of being like collectives. And, we've all heard that if you follow college sports at all. And you said it almost as, I don't want to put words or thoughts, but is collectives like a bad thing in general for high school? Is it seen as, hey, this is something we can't let happen?
Yeah. I mean, I think partially because the existence of collectives, in essence, is to facilitate NIL deals of student athletes at a specific institution, right? So, like, what their purpose is goes against the entire point of what the state association is trying to do, of keeping NIL activities separate from a student athlete athletic participation, right? So, like, if NIL collectives allowed any student to apply for NIL. You know what I mean? Like their whole purpose and sole
right, because it's all sports
goes against technically the regulations around it, and it gets really tricky because who's involved in the collective? Are they? So, yeah, I think you'll see more. And there are some state associations that have added language or addendums against, collectives or the institution of collectives or collectives supporting schools in any way. So it's hard. So my doctorate's in educational policy, and I love reading policies, but ADs don't have time to go through this policy. And unless the state association is really focused on educating their ADs on every line, here's what this means, and if you don't know, call me, that can be tough. But I know they don't have time to do that, right? Which I'll help them with, but I know they don't have time to do that.
Yeah. So, in your opinion, don't you love the way I started that?
I love it. I love it.
In your opinion, where do you think all of this is headed at the high school level? Is it going to follow college, or is there such a kind of differentiation between high school and college, the age of the athletes, getting paid, all those kinds of things? Is there such a differentiation that it'll never get to that level? Or do you see like this is a train on the tracks that we are not going to be able to stop, and we're just going to have to be able to somehow manage it going forward?
Yeah, no, I don't think you can stop it. I mean, I think the train is moving. And I think the train is moving, and you're not going to stop it because of two things: one, money, and two, adults. Right? I mean, for the majority of issues, and you guys have been coaches, the issues aren't with the kids. It's not the kids. It's the adults, right? Who don't understand it, who push it, and now the adults that are business owners that say like, hey, I started a business around NIL in some way, shape, or form at the college level. Well, I want to scale further. I need volume. Well, where's the biggest volume? High school student athletes, right? I mean, you'd be amazed at the businesses who contact me who will ask like, hey, Scott, help us figure out the high school NIL space. And and I'm like, that's not what I do, but let me know what you guys are thinking. And it's like the most aghast idea ever. Like, let's create an app that tips a high school football player after a game because I asked them a question. Like, what? No, what are you doing? No, that's not what we do, right? Now, if there's a high school student athlete who is an entrepreneur and created a business that they want to execute, man, have at it. But I think you can't stop it, but you can at the high school level put guardrails around to ensure educational-based athletics for the majority stay educational-based athletics. Now, there are going to be the elite 2% who have a choice to make, who say, hey, I'm going to start NIL agreements. I don't need high school athletics anymore, right? In most sports, you've got AAU, you've got golf, where high school golf isn't as big of a deal because they play AJGA events. You've got tennis. Like football was like the last stronghold, but then they started the Super League, right? The 8 professional type teams all around the country where they'll like take these kids and move them. I think the elite 2% are going to have to say, how valuable is the high school athletics to me? To the other 98%, it's still doing exactly what it's supposed to do, being an educational basis. Now, can adults handle that? Probably not, right? That's the problem.
It sounds a lot like coaching, right? You've got to really think about what are the adults going to do in this scenario, and how do I not only have to teach the educators or help the educators and the athletes, but what do I have to make the parents and the adults understand?
Yeah. And it's crazy because let's face it, like getting them to understand anything all together is hard enough, right? Let alone something as complex as this potentially where, and I've seen student athletes that now, because college NIL and the collective driven process, and now they can offer contracts, and matriculation and the, national letter of intents going away to athletic aid agreements. There's some, I've talked to some kids who are good enough to do NIL activity in high school that say like, you know what, it's not worth it now. I'm just going to wait, and because I'm going to go play Division I, I'm going to deal with it then, right? Like, is the trade-off, the time, everything else? Now, again, elite 2% is in a different category, and that's a whole different conversation. But I think you're going to see firestorm continue at the college level. I think at some point, football and men's basketball are going to, I think they'll have to leave the academic institution in some way, shape, or form, especially if the Title IX proportionality thing holds. And oh, man, there's not a single school that was preparing for that, right? And again, as that firestorm continues, I think it's honestly a good thing for a high school NIL. Will more kids maybe monetize? Potentially. But the ones that are doing it not because they're student athletes, they just happen to be student athletes.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
So we've been talking about high school. How does the clubs, the travel teams, how does that kind of play into this? Because, the way I think about it, I think, if this is done through their club or through their travel, then they're completely bypassing the high school, any kind of regulations or whatever there might be regarding that. So how does that all factor into this?
Yeah, that's to be seen, right?
Okay.
I think some of the questions that people have, I mean, you have regulations around some of those things by state associations, but also the question is like, well, if you're not there, you're not there, right? Like I always tell people, it doesn't matter until it matters, right? And when it matters is when you beat somebody who knows more than they should know, and you're going to get in trouble, right?
Yeah.
I do think the club scene, I think NIL is just now starting to become more of a conversation regarding how they can use sponsors or different engagement to attract kids, but also provide access to kids that may not have it. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's a bad thing, but I do think there's a fine line because I think there are a lot of high school coaches that also coach club. And I think that's where state association bylaws get really clear, where high school coaches cannot be involved in any sort of NIL activity in any way, shape, or form, right? So like if I'm coaching a kid who's on my high school team, or I have a kid who gets an NIL agreement because the club I coach and then matriculates to the school where I'm coaching, that's the trigger for additional questions, right? And I don't think people are prepared for that yet. But from a 2% standpoint, I think that's why you have the overtime elite programs, right? Like those organizations that in essence are semi-professional athletics prior to professional and college athletics. And you have two routes, right? You can have this NIL agreement, or you can just say, hey, you're going to go professional. We're going to train you that way.
Yeah. Well, we really appreciate you coming on, Dr. Grant. This discussion, and Dan and I talk about, a variety of different topics, but this one we're able to talk about for an hour, 2 hours, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So I'd love to have you come back on again, and we can talk about some other things as well, and talk about some of the good things you're doing around NIL and educating, whether it be kids, parents, high schools, associations, all of that. So yeah.
No, Doctor, are you on social media?
I am.
People follow you. I think they're going to want to.
So on X at Mr. Grant 1161, you can check it out there. That's the big one, and they can always reach out. My email is scott@triplethreatleadership.com. Website, I have a NIL-education.com that takes you to where I write about different state policies, and I go through different things because we didn't even dive into Illinois' policy, but y'all got some unique elements, right? And that's the thing where, well, what does that really mean, right? Like, what does it mean? Well, if a kid posts a social media post on the bus traveling to an event, well, that hits number 4. That would be a violation, right? Who's going to even pay attention and turn them in on that, right? Like, those are the things where you got to ask the question. So I'm always down for talking more. If anybody needs help, support, feel free to reach out. I travel to schools. I work with people to help them understand this from a safe and compliant perspective, not how much money can I make as a high school on NIL.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate it. Dr. Scott Grant from Triple Threat Leadership. And we are the Varsity Voices, and we appreciate you listening. Make sure you follow, subscribe, and like us on wherever you're listening from. And we will talk with you soon.